If you stick around till the end of the video, I'll take you through all the important camera settings, visible and seemingly invisible, that will help you to click super sharp images of birds and wildlife every single time. Why are we talking about a 20.9 megapixel DSLR camera of 2014 in a time of mirrorless cameras in 2024? Well, we want to know if the 7D Mark II is relevant for bird and wildlife photography today. The short answer is yes. Mirrorless cameras are expensive. Top of the line mirrorless cameras cost about 5 lakh rupees, which is about $6,000. And the middle of the line mirrorless cameras, even though they cost about 2.5 to 3 lakh rupees, which is about 3,000 US dollars, fall short for wildlife photography because they are simply not able to focus fast enough on fast moving wildlife compared to a DSLR camera like the Canon 7D Mark II. The 7D Mark II has been discontinued, so the only place to get one is from the used camera market. You can get a used 7D Mark II for about 25,000 to 45,000 Indian rupees, which is roughly about 300 to 500 US dollars. But simply owning a 7D Mark II and using it in the automatic or semi-automatic modes is not going to give you good images. Let's look at the features and functions of this camera, which are relevant for bird and wildlife photography. We'll talk about the number of autofocus points, the autofocus speed and accuracy, frames per second, buffer size, and image quality. Before we dive into these things, I want to tell you that the camera is built like a tank, as they say. It's weather sealed. Weather sealing is important when you're clicking pictures in dusty conditions and in light rain. Although weather sealing is not foolproof, it offers an extra layer of protection. Without weather sealing, lenses can develop fungus inside them, and even the sensor of the camera can develop fungus, affecting the images that you click. The camera has 65 autofocus points, all cross-type. Cross-type focus points focus faster and more accurately than linear focus points, especially when clicking pictures of fast action and in low light. The autofocus speed is supremely fast. The camera can do 10 frames per second. Sure, there are cameras which can do 14 and 20, but 10 is not bad at all. I believe this camera can save about 20 or 25 raw images in the buffer, even with an SD card, a SanDisk Extreme Pro SD card. The camera has never slowed down and I can just go on clicking at 10 frames per second. The Canon 7D Mark II has two card slots, one CF and one for SD. And if you use either CF or SD, the buffer size and the frame rate work well together. I clicked this tiger at 12,800 ISO. And it's full of digital noise, but it's still good enough for a double spread magazine print. But using present day AI noise removal tools, I can make that noise go away completely. So don't be hesitant to use your 7D Mark II at higher ISO values when you have to. Now you know what's keeping the 7D Mark II relevant in 2024. So let's look at how you can set your 7D Mark II for best results in bird and wildlife photography. I set my image quality to RAW, always. RAW files are uncompressed files that let me adjust the white balance, color correct my pictures, and counter lens abnormalities. Image review, off. I'm almost always clicking in the burst mode. I don't need to look at my pictures after I click them. Beep, disabled. Obviously, you don't want your camera beeping every time it achieves focus. Release shutter without card, off. This is very important. Setting it off prevents me from pressing down the shutter release button when there's no card in the camera. so that I don't think I'm clicking pictures when I'm not. Lens aberration correction disabled in the camera, but I'll apply lens corrections in Adobe Lightroom later. This corrects distortion, vignetting and other abnormalities. I set my white balance to AWB, which is auto white balance. Auto lighting optimizer off. This setting, when turned on, pulls out details in the shadows. This can be useful in tricky situations, but it only affects JPEG files, so it's best to leave it off. Picture style, neutral. I like to see my colors muted. It's just an easier starting point for color correction. And then long exposure noise reduction, off. High ISO speed noise reduction, off. Noise reduction can be applied in an editing software if needed. Highlight tone priority, off. Turning this on corrects your exposure in a way that highlights are pulled back. Since I'm always spot metering and checking my exposures all the time, it's no use having it on. HDR mode, disable HDR. I don't like HDR, never did. Now when I'm clicking wildlife, I always, or anything for that matter, I want my focus to be where I want my sharpness to be super sharp wherever I want it to be. And for that, I cannot leave it to the camera to decide where it should focus. So I set my autofocus area to single point and maneuver that single point over the eye of the subject. Mirrorless cameras have animal eye focus, which nails focus on the eye directly. But how effective is it in low light and when the subject is moving remains to be seen. Now let's go to the autofocus menu. Here we have different options, which are combinations of three main settings: the tracking sensitivity, accelerate or decelerate tracking, and AF point auto switching. So instead of choosing one of these, I go to the custom menu settings, configure my menu 1, select items to register and have them here. They are grayed out right now because I have already registered them on my custom menu. I set my tracking sensitivity to locked on. The lower the value, the longer the same subject is tracked if it leaves the AF point. Accelerate or decelerate tracking. I have it to 1. Canon explains that with 0, stable focus can be achieved on subjects that do not accelerate or decelerate. +1 and +2 are suitable for subjects that move suddenly, accelerate or stop. AF point auto switching, 0. This setting is irrelevant for me because it takes effect with 65 point auto selection, zone AF, large zone AF and AF point expansion, whereas I'm always on single point. Now this is an interesting setting. AI servo first and second image priority. This of course is relevant only when you're using your camera in the burst mode, which I always am, and I always set my autofocus mode to AI servo. When it is set to AI servo, as long as I have my shutter release button lightly pressed down, the camera will continue to update focus all the time. Now with this setting, I decide whether or not my camera should go ahead and take the first picture even if the subject is not in focus when I click it. Setting the AI servo first image priority to release means that the camera will record the first image even if the subject is not in focus. Whereas if I set the priority on focus, it will get going only once the subject is in focus. I set both my first and second image priority to focus. This may slow me down for a couple of seconds if the camera is not able to lock focus on my subject straight away, but I'd rather ensure that my subject is in focus than end up with a bunch of out of focus photos. Select AF area, select mode. I'm just interested in the single point and the point within the point for reasons that I've already mentioned. Another interesting setting, orientation linked AF point. Setting it to separate AF points, point only, means that I can select a different single focus point when my camera is horizontal and a different point when it's vertical. So that way I can have different focus points selected when I switch from one orientation to the other. AF point display during focus, all, constant. That way I can see all my points, so I see where I'm going. Now let's talk about the playback menu. Highlight alert, enable, so that I can see blinkies when any part of my picture is overexposed. Now that we've looked at these camera settings, let's take it one step further and look at the different modes. This will help you to understand why some of your pictures turn out blurry or shaky when you use the camera in the automatic or semi-automatic mode. In this segment, you may also see cameras other than the 7D Mark II, but remember, these modes are the same on every camera. You might think that the aperture priority mode is an effective mode for wildlife photography. In the aperture priority mode, we set the aperture value and the camera automatically computes the shutter speed based on the ISO. So let's consider this first case where we set the camera to aperture priority, keep the ISO on auto and let the camera figure out the shutter speed on its own. Now, when we are clicking birds in action, remember the camera does not know what we are clicking and what the speed of action is and what is the minimum shutter speed requirement to get super sharp images of that action. Very often you will find your images are not going to be super sharp because the resulting shutter speed is not fast enough to freeze that action. So it's very important for us to know what our shutter speed needs to be, the minimum shutter speed requirement to get sharp pictures of that action. That's why the aperture priority mode is not as effective in most situations, except when the subject is not moving very rapidly. So that brings us to the next mode, shutter priority. In the shutter priority mode, we set the shutter speed and let the camera figure out the aperture. We can look at our subject and the pace of its movement and figure out what the shutter speed needs to be and let the camera figure out the aperture value. So let's take this second case scenario where we set the camera on shutter priority, set the aperture to auto and let the camera figure out the aperture value. Very often, especially in low light, if we set a fast shutter speed and the camera requires a wider aperture which is just not available on the lens, then the pictures will turn out underexposed. So it's very important for us to have total control over the aperture and the shutter speed. Setting the camera in the manual mode, setting the aperture value to the widest and the shutter speed to what we think is needed for that scenario, and set the ISO to auto. This is a very effective way of doing things, more effective than aperture priority and shutter priority, because here we have set both the aperture and shutter speed according to the action that we are clicking and have the ISO on auto. However, very often the exposure isn't super awesome. It's either too bright or too dark. To ensure that we click a perfect exposure in camera, get super sharpness, it is imperative to learn how to use the camera in the manual mode. Now that you know more about the Canon 7D Mark II, it will help you to click better pictures on your next safari. I'm Girish Menon and I teach photography online through live video calls. You can be based anywhere in the world and still take live photography lessons from me. How cool is that? Please have a look at my website www.girishmenon.com to have a look at the workshops and courses that I offer.